My first job is to welcome you all here. My name is David Knowles and I run the Philanthropic Services team at JB Weir. What our team does is work with our charitable and non-profit clients and our private clients who wish to give or explore the area of giving. So we kind of act as a broker between them, but we also provide advice to both our non-profit clients around governance, around how to increase their appeal, for example, and to our private clients it's more about how to structure their affairs and how to connect appropriately into the organisations and the causes they want to support. This to me is a fascinating topic that we're going to hear about today. I've had quite a lot of experience in this space. Some of the early experience I had was through my relationship with Social Ventures Australia, funding through my previous employer, funding some of their actual ventures run by social entrepreneurs. Then funding the feasibility study for the School for Social Entrepreneurs in Australia, funding that school, and then actually having the pleasure of meeting the first cohort of students there, which was an interesting experience. I don't think they'd like to be called students actually, it was quite a rowdy bunch as you'd hope, but I'm also quite interested in the issue of how this whole movement, if you like, is maturing, and particularly around the questions of sustainability. Whilst I'm a big fan of this, I also have heard some interesting views. I think it was Tim Costello who said a few years back that he didn't get the whole idea of a social entrepreneur because when he was young, he just joined a rock band and got it out of your system. So that was an interesting view. And another interesting view that I read, I think, was the Stanford Social Innovation Review, came across my desk a couple of weeks ago, and there was a comment, there was a quote from Peter Drucker, and that quote basically was that an organisation should not be driven by an individual or require a genius or a particularly talented individual to run it. It should be able to be run by ordinary individuals, and so it should not and cannot survive unless that's the case. So in terms of the sustainable model, I think that's a really interesting question in this space. Either way, whether you're a fan or not, or whether you have a strong opinion at all, I think it's pretty clear that we're now in another great wave of change in the sector. The first one for me in the Australian context was the advent of the private ancillary funds, which drove an awful lot of change and also a big uplift in high net worth giving in Australia. This whole movement is part of a second, I think, potentially much more profound and ultimately beneficial change in society, and so it's a particularly exciting thing that our business spends a lot of time participating in and learning about and sharing information on. So in terms of sharing information and hearing about interesting things, I'm going to hand you over to our speaker now. You all know, she just told me, and I think she's right, you all know Cheryl Kernot from the Centre, and Cheryl is extremely well qualified to talk on this topic, which means it's time for me to resume my seat and hand you over. Suffice to say, have a lovely lunch, hope you enjoy the discussion, and I hope you enjoy all the interesting stuff Cheryl has to say. Thanks.
Thanks, David, and thanks very much to JB Weir for their ongoing support of this knowledge sharing. Those of you who know me, I think, recognise that I'm attracted to big picture stuff. I really like big picture stuff. And those of you who've been taught by me, I hope you would remember my constant exhortation to you to challenge the orthodoxy, ask why the status quo is as it is, and does it serve the best purpose for contemporary society. And really, social entrepreneurship in itself makes that challenge, because it says that the way we accept business as business has really led to huge market failures. And what are we going to do about it? Is it just okay that we have market failures in the area of basic human needs, such as access to affordable medicine, access to light after dark? We've talked about these a lot in class. But if we start with Muhammad Yunus and his big challenge to the orthodoxy and a reimagining of the poor as a new market, that's a huge systems changing thinking. If we move on to John Bird, the founder of The Big Issue in the UK, transforming our attitude to the homeless, his stated goal was to change the way we relate to them, to change their status in our eyes from victim to vendor, and to see what consequences would follow from that. And I heard on the radio just recently in Anti-Poverty Week the story of a Big Issue vendor and a customer here in Sydney over a 5-year period, where the rapport was built up to the extent that she invited the Big Issue vendor to her wedding. Well, that's an amazing transformation for that person's life, I would think. But he also created a social business model, employing the homeless and the marginalised to sell Big Issue magazines. And then a female pioneer in the form of Anita Roddick from The Body Shop. I think she was the first person to take a really good long look at ethical supply chains, and then to harness her own procurement policies around creating shared value through those supply chains. So I want to pay a big tribute to those pioneers, but also acknowledge that we're 30, 40 years on, and while we're seeing in Australia a proliferation of smaller scale and a couple of larger scale social businesses and enterprises, in fact it's in the UK and America where the more mature stage of the revolution is happening. So in this edition of Knowledge Connect, I wanted to focus on these 30 to 40 years, and so I've looked at one huge startup, just a new one, a baby one, but my goodness, the challenge, which I'll go into in a moment. I wanted to look at the recent failure of one of the iconic social enterprises of the movement in the UK and see what we could learn from that. And I also wanted to look at what's happening around the world, but particularly in the UK, with which I'm most familiar. What's happening with respect to government policy? Is this an agenda that's been embraced, really? Are we talking about mainstream incorporation of enabling policies around social enterprise and social business? So starting with Better Place. This is this opened its doors in February 2010, a few years in the planning, of course, but it opened its first demonstration centre in Israel, and the demonstration centre itself is inside a refurbished oil tank. And that's demonstrative of the transformational change that lies at the heart of this business, which is to wean us off internal combustion engines and petrol. So inside this tank is a 1.5 kilometre test track where visitors can drive their electric car. And so what's the status quo that they're challenging? That the way we drive and the way we set up our production of oil and the energy we use to get ourselves around, well, that's the way it's going to be. And if there's a problem with oil, then we can possibly tweak at the edges, which is what we do quite a lot. Fundamental systemic transformation is much less common than tweaking at the edges and hoping that other things will catch up. So we've learnt that partnerships are really important to the success of social enterprises and social businesses, and Better Place established partnerships with the National Electric Utility, venture capital firms, battery companies, car manufacturers, corporate clients, and the Israeli government, because this is where it started. And they want to launch a nationwide network of electric vehicles. But to give you some sense of the buy-in to this idea, I think it's interesting to note that They also have partnerships with firms and governments in Denmark, the United States, Canada, Australia and Japan, and they're in discussion with 25 other governments. That's no small starting point. But the money involved, this is the second biggest startup in history, whether we're talking social or not. And the money involved, so they raised $200 million in their first round of venture capital funding in 2007, $350 million in 2010, and the whole thing's been valued at $1.25 billion. So that's enticed some investment. And what's their mission? It's completely audacious, their mission. To change the way we live, really. To change the way we transport ourselves around. So because you can't get to probably most of you haven't had access to some of the details of this, how this works. Esther, would you mind I've copied 2 slides. So, here we are at home, number 1 at the top, and we charge our vehicle at home. We can have a little station at home, I think it's about $200. Then we head out to work, we drive, we get to work, and work has charging points as well. Like that. And we go through our day, we navigate. If we're going for a long drive, instead of petrol stations, there's a whole network, but nowhere near as many petrol stations. There's a network of switching stations where there's a little conveyor belt and robotic arms will change your battery. And then they've got a bank of batteries being recharged in the background along the way. And then you go home again. The next slide shows you what they look like. And the business model is this. We as consumers from the country, we buy batteries and we buy miles. And unlike the car of today, which comes with everything intact, it's envisaged in this model that we will buy the battery and the car separately. And then we buy service plans. So the cost of the car at the moment is roughly 20,000 American dollars, and a battery is at this stage around 12,000 American dollars. Then we sign up for a service plan and pay a monthly fee instead of buying our petrol. So what they reckon is that frequent drivers like taxi drivers could buy all you can drive, all you can eat kind of plan. Medium range drivers who could predict their yearly driving range could get a fixed monthly price for a specific allocation of miles. And people who don't drive very frequently could go for the pay-as-you-go option. Now, as consumers, we're accustomed to this with other products. So I don't think it requires a huge shift in the way we think about purchasing services, but it just does. The thought of remembering to charge your car when you go home and plugging it in when you get to work, that's a bit of a shift in the way we operate now. I'll just cover one of the criticisms of the plan is that because it relies on renewable energy, and in fact it's committed to using renewable energy, will there be a problem in areas where and this is in many places where the amount of renewable energy available is only around 10% of current output. So in one way it's a driver for take-up of renewable energy, and in another way there's a challenge inherent in getting ahead of the market, and what would be the point in switching from one form of carbon emissions to another. So that's something that they're working on. That gives you a little bit of an idea of what they'll look like, what the charging station looks like. I don't know, most people have an expectation that maybe an electric car will be less comfortable or deficient in some respects. So far, with their demonstration model, that's not proved to be the case in Israel. We have a Better Place outlet here in Australia, and they're working away at building up the charging network. Most people think they're going to be selling electric cars, but in fact, they're not doing that. We're purchasing their charging. That's what they're rolling out in Australia, all the charging equipment. So that's a multi-billion startup with a social purpose. It'll be so interesting to see how that goes. But they're very confident. And the person who started it is a young Israeli who used to work in software, and he was at a global young leaders conference, and they were all given the question, what would you do to make the world a better place? And this was his answer. And since he said that was his answer, he's become completely driven to achieve it. So he also was in the fortunate position of being able to connect to capital, startup capital, pretty easily. So that's a good story on the horizon, but with lots of provisos. But can you imagine in another 50 years when we look back at the time of the internal combustion engine and wonder how we lived like that? The second example that I want to speak about is the closure of the iconic Shore Bank. Now, at conferences around the world for years, everybody's talked about Shore Bank, how wonderful it is, what a pioneer it's been of bringing together mission and finance. So setting up a for-profit banking subsidiary to actually finance what they call community economic development in disadvantaged suburbs, particularly around Chicago and Detroit in America. And it's been going not under the radar exactly, but most national politicians not paying quite, a lot of attention to it until the global financial crisis. And like many other traditional banks, the global financial crisis presented Shore Bank with some quite complicated challenges. And how the system responded is very interesting. The Stanford Social Innovation Review article is called Too Good to Fail. And that, of course, raises, I think, in our mind, the corollary too big to fail, which is what is said and what was said about our traditional banking system and why it had to be bailed out. And so this article asks the question, well, why didn't anybody think that this was too good to fail? And what role did politics play in its ultimate demise? The article actually examines, and it's the first one that's looked at its recent closure, and I think there'll be a lot more learning to come out of subsequent analysis. But it looks at whether it was just simply a victim of the global financial crisis, whether in fact management errors, including ineffective risk management, because they took a lot of risk on the scale of some of the loans, and whether there were misjudgments actually by bank regulators, so not just those who ran the company, but bank regulators that made the company vulnerable, why it was not seen as too good and too big to fail, and the role of what they called toxic politics. Because right up until the very end, the Obama government had said, release these emergency funds to capitalise this bank because it's very important. But that is not what happened in the end. So I thought there were really interesting lessons from this failure. I think we were getting very confident that Shore Bank would not fail. It's quite a shock, it's quite a blow actually to the movement. That's something that's been going for the 40 years. And such a pioneer in the dual mission, financial and social, should fail as a result of possibly a combination of factors, including the global financial crisis. But there are really important lessons for social entrepreneurs, I thought, in this, because we focus on creating social value. And one of the lessons the founders have pointed out from the failure of Shore Bank is that creating social value for the community, such as with their low interest loans, for example, came at the financial cost of the extended time it took to get to the break-even point. Secondly, lower deposit minimums, and this was designed to give greater access to the sort of people who needed to use this bank, they actually meant smaller account balances than the industry average and made it vulnerable. They found that the loan business that it ran had smaller average transaction sizes, and so earned smaller fees, but involved exactly the same amount of time in the paperwork as a larger loan. They found that despite the pressures on them, that mission remained important throughout, and the bank's social investors continued faithfully to their original commitment that investments were for social purpose returns, primarily not for maximising the financial return on their capital. Finally, there was some reflections on, and this is something I see in social enterprises when they start up and they're suddenly flavour of the month. The really interesting observation that the founders accepted flitting around the place, sharing their knowledge with very, very heavy travel schedules at the same time as the management structure they set up required a lot of direct supervision. Now, I see this quite a lot, and it's one of the things that's led Andrew Mawson in the UK to challenge the orthodoxy of the social sector when everybody descended on Bromley by Bow and said, show us what works, show us around. And he eventually, having to allocate a member of staff's time to do most of it, decided to do a fee for service. And the sector was outraged. They said, but we're all in this together, we're all non-profits and charities, how can you charge us? But he revolutionised their thinking around that. They didn't like it. They still expect to be given tours for free. But how could he release a member of staff and not seek to recover those costs? And I think there's still a lot of thinking in the social sector in this country that it's a good thing to go off to conferences unpaid because you're networking, and maybe you're doing a little bit of marketing and branding, but there is still an ultimate cost to your little business if you do a great deal of that. The last thing I'll deal with is the politics, because, this is just resonant of here in a way. A shock jock got a hint that Obama had said this bank has to be saved, got on to the more extreme Republicans, got Fox News on the case, and combination of, it didn't even get to the final vote of the politicians. It was the step before where they made the recommendation of what should go ahead for funding. Toxic politics, they allege, actually killed it before it got to the last stage of the hurdle, and it had to close. It's been bought out by Urban Bank Partner, which has a very similar mission, but nowhere near the scale of the assets that Shore Bank had at its peak. So there's lots of lessons in that. I think the interesting lesson for the US will be to see if anything replaces the role that it had in their marginalised and more disadvantaged communities. Following on from that, I thought, well, if this is what happened with toxic politics in the US, what's happening in the UK? And all of us, I think, with an interest in social sector issues have been looking at the big society experiment in the UK with a lot of interest. The seeds of it were actually, it wasn't called the big society under Labor, but some of the seeds of it about harnessing unclaimed assets more productively for low interest loans for the social sector were begun under the Labor government. But the Conservative Prime Minister David Cameron has made it a huge focus of their reform of the public sector, particularly in service delivery. So what I found really interesting at a conference I went to in the UK back in September was the paper that I've referred to at number 4 in Knowledge Connect, which is, and it drew my attention to a private member's bill which was actually putting a bill in place to legislate for the creation of social value. And I thought, my goodness, that's a radical thing. How on earth do you do that? The way it works in the UK is like Australia. You can get quite a lot of private members' bills put up, but probably one sees the light of day over a whole year, except under the new paradigm where more than one's filtering its way to the top. But it was interesting that of all of them on the list, this was the one that was championed. But to go back a step to what the Conservative Liberal Democrat coalition government said it's all about, they say it's a move away from big government, centralised decision makings, symbolised by their centre of power in Whitehall, a devolution to decision making and more autonomy and opening up of public services at the local level. So, you know, the strapline would be big society, from big state to small state at one level with greater public involvement. So what they say is they want to give the right for a much more diverse provider of public services, say health services in Australia. You know, we have pretty much a binary situation, public or private. There are a few others, few community-led organisations out there, but essentially we haven't opened up, except in employment, diversity of provision in the way they have in the UK. So one of the political questions here is this a sincere belief on the part of the UK, or is it a very clever rationale for the massive cost-cutting to public service delivery that's going on there? Because there is still an assumption that the social sector will compete for the contracts and subsidise, cross-subsidise themselves by not opting for full cost recovery, which is what private sector tenderers tend to do. So the jury's out on this, and if you look at the UK papers, you will see charities closing, you will see some considering merging, and I'm not opposed to that. I think if we've got 600,000 of them in this country, I think there's some rationale for looking over the hill and seeing if you're duplicating the efforts of somebody else. However, the government's done some pretty interesting enabling things. They've said that in this new, more diverse provision of public services, there's an important role for mutuals and cooperatives. And I know we've touched on this in discussion before, but what they've actually gone out of their way to say, we're going to make it easier for frontline staff, particularly in health, to form their own employee-owned cooperatives or employee-owned enterprises. Do you think that might be a good suggestion to Qantas? Don't know where the capital would come from. However, we do have a new Australian employee ownership, what are they called? It's under the auspices of Social Business Australia. Anyway, the federal government, around the stimulus package number 1, actually gave some money to seed fund greater thinking around this as one solution to companies having to close down. So they're going along quietly, and they've facilitated a number of smaller employee buyouts in Australia. In the UK, though, the government is actually saying, okay, what are the impediments in people moving from public sector to social sector provision? And the big one is the pension, because your superannuation. If you've been a health employee for a long time and you have accumulated your superannuation, then you're less likely to put it at risk by transferring into a employee-owned health service, however innovative it might be. So what the previous government did, which was a disruptive innovation, was to say to all NHS employees, we will consider you as remaining in the NHS family, and we will continue to back your pension payments until such time as you move to a new employer. Now that's, after you've moved to a frontline employee-run organisation, but if you then move again, you lose that entitlement. So that's why the current government can say there's a really big role for mutuals and cooperatives to look at public service provision. Now, I personally would think there is such an opportunity in Australia for health service delivery to be opened up, to be niched in a really innovative way. I don't hear much of that talked about in Australia as yet, but there is in this article I draw your attention to an Indigenous community-controlled mutual which provides housing and health services for Aboriginal, Torres Strait and South Sea Islander people in Bowen, Collinsville and Proserpine in Queensland. It seems to me that's a very good response which acknowledges some of the cultural ownership differences that Indigenous people have with respect to us. Then there's the legislating for social value, where, surprise, surprise, they found that what the government was saying up front, which is we're really committed to this, we really believe in the role of voluntary and community organisations and social enterprises to deliver these services effectively. That's the public rhetoric. Behind the scenes, when they were let loose on the debate, a lot of backbenchers said, well, what is this social enterprise thing anyway? Every enterprise creates value of some sort, and why do we have to have a special category for social enterprise? So the authors of the paper that I've referred to have actually gone through the Hansard second reading debates, which members of Parliament probably think no one pays much attention to. But these researchers have gone through and they've said, look, David Cameron's out there saying, here's a new vision for society. We're unleashing the creative potential of voluntary and community organisations and localism and all the things that make us different from the Labor Party. And then behind the scenes, there's a bit of an argument going on in the Department of Prime Minister and Cabinet, where some of the public servants and some of the senior ministers are saying, but hang on, we believe in the market. We're market liberals. And in fact, this might cost us money because all of these voluntary and community organisations are bound to be less efficient. So maybe this isn't the best way to use taxpayers' money. But the person who sponsored the private members bill, who is a Conservative, who thinks that you can identify the added social value that's created by these organisations, he said we should tilt the playing field a little bit to make it more possible. And tilting the playing field included in the bill a requirement that when local government, for example here in Australia, or other authorities were going to purchase services, they had to give high regard to the social value that would be created by procuring locally, for example. And so the market liberals thought, that's a bit prescriptive. So sadly, this has just gone through the second reading and committee stage. And guess what happened? The term social enterprise was removed from the title of the bill. The requirement on government to draw up a national social enterprise strategy was also removed. The proposed duty on local authorities to set out how they will engage with local social enterprises was also removed. But there's one good thing left. They've made a national commitment to, through this one, modernising commissioning. Now that's another word for what we call social procurement. And I'd urge you to have a good look at the creative things we've been doing in Australia, not required by law, as a matter of fact pointed out that you can do it and not fall foul of national competition policy. But this is going to set up extensive training for all the people who make the decisions about procurement, to say to them, listen, there are all these voluntary and community and social enterprises out there who actually offer these services. So you need to make the connection between purchasing from these providers, getting good value for your money, and adding social value as you go. I think this is an agenda that's got an exciting way to go in Australia and elsewhere in the world. Finally, there's my book review. The Illusions of Entrepreneurship. I thought if Andrew Douglas was here, it'd be great to have his reflections on this. And I should tell you, in the spirit of looking at things scaling up and growing in Australia, Andrew's soft landing has gone from its initial contract with Wollongong Council to 3 others and 9 service agreements with other councils, which is the next level down. He also got an innovation grant to, the bit where he stuffs the fabric into the leather shells of the punching bags and sporting equipment. He got an innovation grant to develop the machine. And now he's now created a subsidiary social business called Featherweight, employing more people to do just that part of the recycling processes involved in the whole mattress recycling. And really, that I'm not allowed to tell you how much it's turning over a month, but it's startlingly wonderful. And it has great capacity to grow to an enormous scale if we can... I think we don't have to do much. Andrew's learnt so much. So, the illusions of entrepreneurship. I asked Jeff Mulgan to recommend a good book he'd read recently that might be relevant to this. And he said, I've read a few, but maybe this one. He said, even though it's 2008, given the interest in social entrepreneurship, he said he found it really interesting because, again, it challenged quite a few of the things that we think already about entrepreneurship generally. And he said, look, there's just so much mythology around. You get this notion that there are any number of penniless dropouts who become multimillionaires. And then there are all these people out there who are a genius, who are, they're born, they're not made, that there's nothing you can do to teach people how to be successful, combining entrepreneurial drive with business acumen, for example. So he said, I just want to look at this mythology, I want to look at the evidence, and I want to ask some fundamental questions about what we all believe about entrepreneurship. So I thought the first thing he found was, considering this is an American book and written for an American audience, he found that the US isn't a very entrepreneurial country, and that in fact Peruvians and Ugandans are 3.5 times as likely as Americans to start their own business. Now, talk about challenging an orthodoxy, that's one. The second one, the typical startup isn't innovative at all. As a matter of fact, it's very often, I just want to work for myself. It has no plans to grow, has one employee, and generates less than $100,000 in revenue. I think there's an application there that we could look at with some people who think they might want to be social entrepreneurs, but maybe don't have the same passion that's driving them. The typical startup is capitalised with $25,000. That's a very typical amount for social enterprises as well. And usually from the founder's savings. But he says the evidence shows that those that succeed most are those who have much more than that at their startup. He says that knowing your industry, your sector matters. This is not rocket science. I mean, Andrew worked in jobs for the dole and job services, so it's not new to him to try and find employment, but he knows the needs of the employees that he's seeking to attract and employ. It's the conclusions that I thought were... one more thing that I think I should point out. He says that crucial to the success of whether you're a normal business or a social business is the importance of financial controls, of focusing activities on a single product, service or market. Now, some people try to be all things at the beginning, and Rebecca Scott from Street thought that the best thing for her to do would be to cut the price of her coffee and attract people. And in fact, that was the wrong thing to do, because she was offering coffee with an extra social value. We buy the copy. What we pay employs formerly homeless young people and gives them work experience on the coffee cart. So just saying, I'm going to cut the price and that'll make me competitive was the wrong way to go. Fortunately, she didn't do it. But he says that we've got to let go of this notion that we'll all be a better society if we have more and more and more entrepreneurs. He says we need to change our basic assumption. It's naive to believe that all entrepreneurship is good. He says it's more true that only a few select entrepreneurs will create the businesses that will take people out of poverty, encourage innovation, create jobs, reduce unemployment, and address market failure and competitiveness. He therefore says we should pick a few of those winners out of the multitude of the ones that try to start up every year. We should pick a few of those winners and invest in them. Now, that is going against the orthodoxy of the moment of not picking winners. So I found this quite an interesting read, and I thank Jeff Mulgan for recommending it to me. So just a final encouragement to you. You might like to join the social entrepreneurship discussion on 3 blogs that I've recommended, our own, of course. The Stanford Social Innovation Review blog and the Social Edge blog, which is associated with the Skoll Centre for Social Entrepreneurship at Oxford and the Skoll Forum. Thank you for that. I hope that was a quick immersion update, and open it now to questions and discussion. Thank you.